Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn from the National Interest. I'm here with Brian Katulis from the Center for American Progress, and we're going to be discussing Pakistan today. And in looking at the Pakistan issue, I thought of Fareed Zakaria's cover story in Newsweek a few weeks ago, in which he asked the question, what did Bush get right? And Zakaria pointed out to some of the more moderate stances that the Bush administration has taken towards Iran and with the appointment of Robert Gates as defense secretary. And his argument was that the next administration should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. That in fact the mistake the Bush administration made when it came into office initially was to reject in toto everything that the Clinton administration had espoused, including nation building. Now, of course, the Bush administration has found itself mired in nation building. But the other thing that occurred to me in retrospect after reading the piece was that much of Bush administration foreign policy, even though they may have moderated in certain aspects, seems to be falling apart. The relationship with Russia is in tatters. And now we have Pakistan. Is Pakistan another area, including Afghanistan, where we just had 10 French soldiers that were killed yesterday? Is that another area that is falling apart under the Bush administration? So my first question would be, has the Bush administration in fact bungled the Pakistan relationship by supporting Pervez Musharraf so ardently? Or was it making the best choice under the circumstances?
Well, I agree with much of what you said there in the introduction. I think when historians look back on this period from 2002 to 2008 globally, they'll see this as a period where the United States lost a lot of influence and power and our ability to shape events. And I think the high water mark for this was the summer of 2006, where you had essentially a civil war raging in Iraq. You had one of our major allies, Israel, being attacked both from its northern and southern borders. You had the Taliban in Afghanistan resurging, and that continues. Pakistan wasn't helping us out much with that. And you had North Korea firing off missiles and then eventually testing a nuclear weapon. I think the story of the last 18 months has been a tack towards pragmatism, as Fareed talks about in his article. I don't think it's a full tack, and I don't think all of the ideologues and the neoconservatives that really ran the policy from 2002 to 2006 are gone. But it's telling to me that John Bolton, every time that he is screaming and hollering about a lot of things with the Bush administration policy, every time he complains, that's actually a good thing for U.S. foreign policy. When it comes to Pakistan, I think this will be one of the glaring mistakes when people look back on the period of the Bush administration. Pervez Musharraf came to power in a coup in 1999, and essentially for the last 9 years ruled Pakistan with a pretty tight grip, undemocratically. After 9/11, the Bush administration issued an ultimatum to Musharraf, and Musharraf became our guy. We gave him more than...
But Brian, if you look at that ultimatum,
right?
Didn't Musharraf and the other generals and the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, which has been the focus, that has been supporting the Taliban, didn't they play the United States like a fiddle? Essentially, they managed to win billions in military aid from the Bush administration, much of which was dumped into building up the Air Force, and
right,
to be able to fight India. On the other hand, they also, it's quite remarkable, in his new book, Descent into Chaos, Ahmed Rashid argues that Pakistan almost single-handedly helped resurrect the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban after the American invasion of Afghanistan, that they essentially left South Waziristan open. Now, he doesn't quite say, he doesn't come down and say definitively that it was deliberate that they left South Waziristan open, but he pretty much suggests, and his argument is that Pakistan is almost wholly responsible for helping to help what was a tattered, beaten force become again a threat to the West, both because Pakistan has the interest it was always a supporter of the Taliban to help try and increase its own influence inside Afghanistan. And the second front for it, of course, is Kashmir, where it likes to bolster the militants.
Absolutely. The Bush administration was very naive in pinning its hopes on Musharraf and the military and the ISI. And it didn't deliver in many real ways. And that collapsed in 2007. I was in Pakistan 3 times in the last 9 months, and I was there during the imposition of emergency rule. And I think we really saw the collapse of that policy. It's become cliche here in Washington to talk about Bush having a Musharraf-centric policy, but I think it's true to a large extent. And as you point out, it didn't deliver. It did not deliver on what we had hoped. Musharraf signed a deal that basically gave a safe haven to the militant groups and forces like Al-Qaeda in Waziristan and other parts of Pakistan. And frankly, you see the incidents yesterday in Afghanistan where 10 French paratroopers were killed. You had a suicide bombing where I think there were at least 10 suicide bombers that attacked a large base in the eastern part of Afghanistan. And all of these attacks, the sharp increase in attacks, Pentagon says there's basically been a 40% increase in attacks in the last 7 months, are due to the safe havens that continue to exist. So, Musharraf is gone. He jumped before he was pushed. He was facing impeachment because of many mistakes he made.
Just to interject quickly, you also had, in some ways, what was to me the most significant was the bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul. That was almost a casus belli for a wider war.
Right. You had that, and you also had an attempted assassination earlier this spring against Afghan President Hamid Karzai, all of which U.S. intelligence agencies have indicated that they have evidence that the ISI or some elements supported by the ISI have been involved with. And this has become such a big problem for the United States that we sent Steve Kappas, who's the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, to Islamabad last month on July 12th. He went on a trip that Admiral Mullen went to. And the focus of Kappas' trip was to complain, and not to Musharraf, but to the other security authorities, the ISI, and in particular Ashfaq Kayani, the Chief of Staff of the Army in Pakistan, to say, look, stop this support. You're essentially undermining our efforts in Afghanistan. You're inflaming a situation with India, which has been tense for decades, but actually was quite calm, up to about a few years ago. And that's been inflamed. You see the rise of violence in Kashmir. And all of this, I think, points to a strategy under the Bush administration, and frankly, even before the Bush administration, where we have not had a clear and coherent Pakistan policy. A lot of the policy failures...
But to be fair, the Clinton administration was tougher on Pakistan. Admittedly, it was before 9/11, but there were sanctions on Pakistan.
Right, especially after their testing of a nuclear weapon. But you're absolutely correct, though. We did little before that testing of a nuclear weapon, and also the support that was, frankly, provided to the Taliban through the 1990s in the Clinton administration. So there's a lot of blame that that could be spread around here. It's bipartisan failures, and I think it's in part because it's such a tough and difficult country. They have many different challenges in trying to control the ISI and the military. The threat posed by AQ Khan, for instance, the father of the Pakistan nuclear bomb, and his proliferation, that extends back decades.
But if we're looking at the past, if we're looking at Pervez Musharraf, who just stepped down as the president of Pakistan and gave the hour-long speech justifying his rule, the measures he took, the imposition of emergency rule, the coup that he launched in '99 originally come to power. Now the person who appointed him originally is back, Nawaz Sharif, and if you're the Bush administration, they sort of follow the tried and American policy, isn't it, of supporting the local despot almost.
Right.
We did this with the Shah of Iran. Now, admittedly, Musharraf wasn't as entrenched. But, we did it in Central America, where we would support right-wing dictatorships as the lesser evil. How much could the Bush administration have done to push Pakistan after 9/11, and how much do we want to get tangled up in Pakistani domestic politics? Because the question for me is, the more that America starts to intrude and try to dictate what's going on inside a country, the more entangled it becomes and the more animosity that tends to breed.
Well, I think at this point we've become very radioactive, so any visible U.S. intervention I think is counterproductive, and this goes for not only Pakistan but other places like the Palestinian territories or other places. Every time we have senior officials, especially from the Bush administration, meeting with leaders in certain countries, and this even includes Iraq, by the way, it actually, I think, serves to undermine the domestic credibility of some of these leaders. So that's why I think it's more important for the U.S., I think, to play a much more quiet and behind-the-scenes role. And I think, if you go back to the Bush administration's central argument on national security, the so-called freedom agenda, if you look at how that was actually applied in Pakistan, I think this helped further undermine American credibility. When I was in Pakistan in December during emergency rule, it struck me that Musharraf, in many ways, was mimicking a lot of Bush's approach to leadership. When he lifted emergency rule, Musharraf delivered this speech, a nationwide speech, which is about as long as the one that he gave the other day, resigning. And he said, essentially, I imposed emergency rule to advance democracy, and now I'm lifting it to preserve democracy. And it struck me...
In a sense, the term democracy has almost become the communism of our day, hasn't it? It's
exactly,
sort of all-purpose word that can justify anything.
And this simplistic notion that was at the heart of the Bush national security strategy, that if we advance freedom and democracy, we will defeat terrorism and extremism, actually has not worked out. If you look at it in many ways, the U.S. effort to promote democracy has stalled around the world and is actually seeing some retrenchment. But in Pakistan, Musharraf in particular, I think, mimicked a lot of what Bush did. He took a very real terrorist threat, and in 2007, Musharraf used that threat as an excuse to bludgeon his political opponents at home, his domestic political opponents,
right.
Because when he imposed emergency rule, he didn't jail terrorists. He jailed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and about 3,000 lawyers and civil society activists. So in that way...
that was Cheney's next step. He never got to implement it.
Well, and then Bush Bush actually has painted a lot of his political opponents as in bed with the terrorists. If you look at the 06 campaign and 04, and this is, Musharraf learned his tricks of the trade from Bush. Musharraf used this terrorist threat to expand executive authority at the expense of the judiciary and the legislative. Again, taking a page from Bush's
Brian,
book.
it might be a little unfair to Bush to say that Musharraf learned the tricks of the trade, because obviously all of these Putin has behaved in the same manner. I mean, I think what Bush gave them was more of a rhetorical fig leaf, because the United States, which had purported to be the bastion of democracy and spreading it, was itself engaging in these activities, so it helped legitimize them, didn't it?
Well, I think that's right, but this whole notion that we're going to, and it is a fig leaf, that we're going to expand democracy to defeat terrorism has actually backfired. And in a place like Pakistan, in 2007, they saw a doubling in the number of terrorist attacks against civilians there, quadrupling in terms of how many civilians were killed. So it didn't provide actually sustainability. It didn't provide democracy. And when I was in Pakistan in December, the civil society activists and others were very cynical about the U.S. approach. They saw it for what it was worth, that we were just backing our man in Pakistan and continuing our addiction to dictators. And really no fundamental change. And this has not actually helped us more broadly with the 165 million Pakistanis who, in some ways, some parts of the society has become much more radicalized and very extremist.
That was my next question for you.
Yeah,
we have the situation where Musharraf is gone, and supposedly I heard he might end up even in the state of New Mexico.
Right, yeah, I heard that too, yeah.
I don't know how he would enjoy that, but I guess it's somewhat similar terrain to what's
I don't know if they're putting him in the witness protection program or something like that, but because there will be threats against his life. There were about 8 or 9 assassination attempts. Yeah,
it occurred to me that there should be some sort of depot for former dictators, retirees from the business and trade, who could all gather together on some island. And
they used to go to Saudi Arabia, Idi Amin and other places. And it's interesting, and this is an aside, the Saudis and the Gulf Arabs play as much, if not even a stronger role than the United States in terms of financing different Pakistani movements and figures, and then also they were key, the Saudis, in negotiating Musharraf's departure,
Right.
which is part of the story that hasn't come
Right.
out yet.
Of course, he wouldn't want to go to Saudi Arabia because that's where Sharif had been essentially exiled to, so it would be too much closing the circle.
Right.
But it is clear that being a dictator in exile can be a lonely job.
Yeah.
What do you think, if you look at the radicalization of Pakistani society, which, I mean, we can heap some of the blame on the Bush administration for following flawed policy, but obviously those, in a sense, it's not that they're sins of omission, but the real weight has to fall on the ISI, the generals who have bred a threat that is now turned against them, which I don't think they expected. They thought that they could control these militants, that they would be useful to in Afghanistan, and that they would be able to stoke the conflict over Kashmir. Now they're facing their own troubles. Now we have these civilians, and we have the jockeying for power. I'm wondering who you think is going to come out on top. How radicalized has Pakistan become, and what are the chances for following a more hopeful course? Or is the country going to continue to spiral downward?
Yeah. Well, first, the support for different extremist groups goes back to the 1980s, and it doesn't only include the Pakistani government.
Right,
You need only watch
right.
the Charlie Wilson's War, that movie, or read his book to see that many of the Mujahideen and the forces that we're actually fighting against now in Afghanistan were ones that we supported as a bulwark against the Soviet Union.
Via the Pakistanis. I mean, a lot
Exactly.
of the
Yeah.
stuff
Yeah. And I also think that this notion of the loss of control by parts of the ISI of the local Taliban and some elements of Al Qaeda, I actually think this is a little bit more complicated, because it was interesting to me that there was a decrease in the terrorist attacks earlier this year, in the first quarter of this year, especially around these elections in February. I was there for the elections, too, in Pakistan. And a lot of people, close observers and intel analysts and others, were wondering, did somebody in the ISI essentially tell some of the local militants to cut it out for a short period of time? Was there some sort of control there? Were there deals? And there was also negotiations happening, which continue with some of these tribal and militant groups in Pakistan. But to your question of where is it all heading, I think, well, first, within 30 days, the Electoral College in Pakistan will choose a new president. That the Electoral College is the parliament and the four provincial assemblies. I think it's difficult to predict who will come out on top, but it's either going to be Nawaz Sharif, the former prime minister, who's the head of one major political party, or Asif Ali Zardari, the widower of Benazir Bhutto.
It looks like Zardari is getting a lot of support, isn't he?
Well, he's getting a lot of support? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, that he is getting significant support.
Well, yeah, and part of the challenge with this coalition, this PMLN and the PPP, which are the two parties represented by Zardari and Sharif, they've had this uneasy coalition since the February elections, and it was mostly centered on their hatred of Musharraf and getting him gone. Yesterday, the two men had a meeting in Islamabad, and it blew up. Nawaz Sharif left, hopped in his car, and drove 4 hours to Lahore. It blew up over the issue of reinstituting the judges, and in particular this Chief Justice Iftikhar Chowdhury.
Right.
Zardari does not want him back in as Chief Justice because Zardari has a pretty spotty record. He's been accused of corruption and seems to have been involved with millions of dollars, if not billions, actually, gone missing. And he also has this amnesty, and he fears that this amnesty might be lifted if Chowdhury is reinstituted. So there's a lot of Byzantine, internecine jockeying that's going on here. But the broader point is this, that these two guys, Zardari and Nawaz Sharif, come from families that are essentially feudal families that have controlled Pakistani politics for decades. that it often seemed like the leadership in Pakistan is a game of musical chairs where nobody actually removes the chairs, and some of the same faces still stick around. And in terms of who's going to come out on top between this battle between Zardari and Sharif, if you look at the public opinion polls, and I don't know how much they matter, Sharif has actually seen his credibility shoot up in the last couple of months, in part because of his stance on the judges. The Pakistani public, about 83%, say that they want the Chief Justice reinstituted, and they don't want any hedging on this. They feel like this is the best way to move forward and restore the system. And Zardari's been hedging, in part because of his own corruption issues and all of those challenges. So if I were to guess, and this is just a guess, Sharif may come out on top, and that's not going to make it any easier for U.S. policy, looping back to our interests in that country, because Sharif has close ties with some of the more Islamist groups and some of the more militant groups, and he was also the prime minister of the country when they tested their nuclear weapon. So all of these things, I think, imply a very difficult several years ahead for the next administration, whether it's a McCain or an Obama administration.
In some ways, when we discussed the problems that Pakistan faces, and we haven't touched on its economic problems. Its rupee has apparently lost a fifth of its value against the dollar. The economy is tumbling, which Musharraf pointed out with some Schadenfreude in his farewell address.
Right.
It does have some aspects of Weimar Germany, doesn't it? With these sort of revolving doors, state of emergencies. You have essentially what are paramilitary groups inside the country. You have outside countries watching what appears to be the disintegration. Now, I'm not saying that Pakistan is on the verge of falling apart, but it is clearly going down a road of disintegration rather than on a more positive course.
Right, and you add to that the nuclear weapons too. This is a nuclear armed nation.
How secure do you think now? The Pakistanis claim that those weapons really are secure and so forth. How much faith do you have in that? If a country like that really, how would you assess the chances of Pakistan going under as a nation state and being essentially, let's face it, Al Qaeda, the Taliban are like hosts. They want to take over the body,
right?
And
well, I think
they'd be much better off in charge of running or having some degree of control over Pakistan than they would over Afghanistan. Pakistan is a much more advanced country and has
I think there's very little chance in the center part of the country. You could almost break it down by province, but the Punjab, which is the most populous province, and that includes the capital city and major cities, I think there's very little chance that Al-Qaeda or the local Taliban could actually take over these areas. If you go to Lahore, for instance, it's fairly secure. Rawalpindi, this is the center of the army, and you've got it. People forget when you think about the 165 million Pakistanis, a population which is larger than Russia's. You've got a lot of educated elites and others who frankly have nothing to do and have a different mindset.
But could you have said something like this about Iran before 1979, or you think it was more that the Shah's rule was essentially more precarious and that the army, you do have this tradition of this independent officer corps in Pakistan, which is essentially the backbone of the nation.
Right, yeah. I see the comparisons between Iran and Pakistan, or a pre-revolutionary Iran and Pakistan today, a little facile. I think it's a little like apples and bicycles. I think it's important to think through the consequences of just blindly supporting unpopular leaders. But structurally, I think if you look at that core in the center of Pakistan, I think there's very little likelihood that you'd have extremist clerics taking over the army and the military in particular. We've got some close allies, like I mentioned, the Chief of Staff, Ashfaq Kayani, who, interestingly enough, showed up in Kabul yesterday. One of the first times I think the chief of staff of the Pakistani army showed up for a meeting with the NATO and Afghanistan to address some of these issues. So in the center part of the country, I don't think it's as much of a problem. Clearly, when you go to places like Peshawar, I was there in April, up in the northwestern part of the country, significant challenges there where there are pockets of the country where nobody controls. And getting the Pakistanis and the Frontier Corps to control that part, in the northwestern frontier provinces, is a major challenge. And the federally administered tribal areas has been a huge challenge. In the southeastern, western part of the country, in Baluchistan, it's another area which borders Afghanistan and Iran, and this is again one of these lawless zones of instability. And I think the notion of actually Pakistan stabilizing these areas anytime soon is wildly unrealistic. It's going to take years for them to try to do something, and they're not even trying, I don't think. And in Karachi, in the Sindh province, I think there's a little bit more security there. So if you break it down, I don't think you'll see a total collapse inside of Pakistan, but we have already seen collapse in certain parts of Pakistan. This is why our intelligence agencies for the last year, in the National Intelligence Estimates and their Global Threat Assessment earlier this year, have been screaming to the Hill and to the administration saying, look, if there's another terrorist attack in the United States or in Britain or in Western Europe, it's likely going to come out of Pakistan because of all of the intel we're getting.
But Brian,
the
we know
training
that
camps.
some of the past attacks that have taken place in the past few years were actually planned. I mean, Al-Qaeda has regrouped in these areas. We're pretty sure that Osama bin Laden is ensconced in the mountainous region, and Al-Qaeda is training operatives again. And,
and you've got figures like, those are the big names. You've got a figure, I'd like to highlight, Rashid Rauf. This was a man who was at the center of the plot. If you remember, in the summer of 2006, there was a plot to blow up airliners from Britain to the United States. And there was a lot of news, and it became a political issue, too. Rashid Rauf was actually released in mid-December when I was in Islamabad. I put released in quote because he left a court appearance and was allowed to go in a private taxi from that court appearance. And the police allowed him to get a sandwich, and then they stopped off at a mosque. And he actually left. He disappeared. And this has been one instance, Rashid Rauf, which got a little bit of attention in the New York Times when it happened. But one of several instances where the Pakistani government and the security infrastructure have actually caught and released a lot of these individuals. And it's presumed that many of them have gone to the tribal areas. And we have okay intelligence. I was going to say good intelligence, but we don't have good enough intelligence on Pakistan. I don't know if you saw the LA Times article at the end of last month where the former CIA chief of station was essentially saying we've got more counterintelligence and counterterrorist assets in Rome, Italy than we do have in Pakistan. So we don't have a good sense of what's going on in these areas. And I think, whomever wins this race, whether it's Obama or McCain, Pakistan is going to be the cause of the most 3 a.m. calls for the next president because of all of these variables and because of these terrorists getting these safe havens there.
Well, Barack Obama got into a lot of hot water when he said that he would engage in a form of hot pursuit.
Right.
That he would not hesitate to attack inside Pakistan, and he was derided as naive by Hillary Clinton.
Right.
I haven't seen John McCain really address the Pakistan issue. One of the reasons that an issue like that is tricky for the neoconservatives is because it doesn't really lend itself to a black and white assessment. I mean, Pakistan is an ally, but it's sort of become an unsavory one, and given all the political machinations in the country and its sort of unreliable status. So if Obama became president, my guess is that he would in fact not live up to his campaign rhetoric and attack inside, what we consider to be Pakistani territory.
I disagree with that because, look, first, I didn't understand the controversy about his statement, not only from Clinton, but a lot of the Republicans criticized it as naive and reckless. But
right.
It's actually a statement of current policy. We do this in hot pursuit, and actually, if we have troops that are attacked in Afghanistan. And if you go to these border regions, you see there's not really a border.
Right. But I think what Obama was proposing, I mean, yes, that started a couple of years ago because the military got really frustrated.
Right.
I wasn't Obama. My sense was that he was proposing a more major military action than it has been contemplated until now.
No, I actually think it was a continuation of current policy where we've done, these strikes with unmanned aerial vehicles. In some instances, we've gone across the border with troops in hot pursuit. And the other, in addition, whomever is the president of the United States, I think it's important to think also about General David Petraeus, who will assume the command of Central Command in September. He's the top general in Iraq right now. And in his recent testimony to Congress, he highlighted Pakistan as a major concern and a major area. So the military professionals, in addition to what the political leadership in Washington, whomever it is, will actually be making, I think, some key decisions in this front. I don't suspect you're going to see a major ground invasion of Pakistan. It would be silly and it would actually be counterproductive to doing this. But I think you'll see a different approach and a much stronger focus, a recalibration, if you will. And this is probably not a bold prediction, but this time next year, whomever is the president, I think we're going to be talking even more about Pakistan than we are today, and a little bit less about Iraq, because we've got to rebalance some of these priorities, and because we've seen this uptick in strikes in Afghanistan. So I don't think, one thing on McCain's statements, he said very little about Pakistan. I think in February after the elections, which were fairly successful there in terms of they were peaceful, they were seen to be legitimate expression of will of the people, he praised, because McCain has essentially adopted the freedom agenda. His essay in Foreign Affairs that he's going to secure an enduring peace built on freedom tips his hand. His policy on Russia.
Does it tip his hand, though? I mean, you could. I'm just going to throw that to for argument's sake. But if you look at the Condoleezza Rice Foreign Affairs piece, she talked about the end of nation building. This is in 2000.
Right. Yeah.
Need to retreat. The need to reach out to China and Russia.
Yeah.
Of course, the administration turned on a dime after September 11th, and Condoleezza Rice became the great champion of the neoconservative agenda, at least rhetorically.
Yeah.
I wonder if McCain isn't positioned to execute a U-turn, and then I don't think this is going to happen, but it's not impossible that he's going to run on the neoconservative agenda and then just dump it overboard once he becomes president, because he does have other realist advisors. I mean, it's impossible to know for sure.
Right, I agree with that. And with Rice, she was one of the weakest national security advisors we've had in the history of our country. But her voice in terms of
what
guiding,
about Secretary of State?
Well, her voice in guiding, she hasn't been, I think, a very strong Secretary of State either in terms of managing the department. She talked about transformational diplomacy and a whole host of other things, but. When you look at her voice and her selections and what she did quietly and behind the scenes on North Korea, on a whole host of other issues, I think she maintained a lot of her more pragmatic and traditional conservative foreign policy ideals. And there was a spell, obviously, from 2002 to about 2006, where her voice wasn't as strong and didn't, I think, matter as much. There's certainly, since 2006, I think her voice, and plus, the impact of some of the career professionals, both in the military, whether it's Admiral Mullen or Petraeus, General Petraeus, or some of the Bill Burns of the world, top diplomats, I think they've had much more of an impact working in collaboration with Rice on tacking a little bit towards pragmatism and away from the freedom agenda.
That's true, but if you look at the current state of the administration's foreign policy, you really would have to say that it's really become a cropper. Certainly, the Georgian events have essentially washed away whatever progress they might have made with Russia. I mean, the whole policy seems to have been something of a sham.
Yeah, we've had no policy with Russia. I agree with you there. I think
they had it. They had this two-track kind of policy, which is to try and, I mean, they'll argue up and down that they weren't doing this, but from the Russian perspective, obviously they are trying to encircle it with the missile defense systems,
right?
And expansion of NATO, and I wonder if Pakistan is in Afghanistan are the next shoe to drop. I mean, because the administration just wanted to scuttle out of Washington and have everything be quiet for the next year and have a few signs of progress. I mean, Condi Rice was intent on rehabilitating her reputation, but now to me she sounds feckless on Russia. She's issuing empty bluster and threats that she's unable to carry out. The Russians are ignoring the timeline. They're setting their own timeline.
Yeah, and I think that's a consequence. I mean, I agree, and Rice has consistently mishandled Russia throughout, but I think that's a consequence of where we started, the loss of leverage and power and credibility of the U.S. I mean, when Russia invaded Georgia, the big question on the minds of many people were what were the so-called carrots and sticks that we could actually do to persuade Russia to pull back? What is our strategy there? So I think that is still in tatters, and I think you've got at this late stage in the Bush administration, some elements of the rhetorical freedom agenda still maintaining its dominance, and I think Russia is the case there, and we have no clear answer.
And in principle, we should say, I mean, the United States espousing a freedom agenda is not a bad thing. I mean, that's what you want the United States to stand for, but the administration did it in such a hypocritical and two-faced way that they in fact ended up damaging the very policies that they claim they're espousing. Because one of the things we haven't mentioned, for example, is that one of the areas where the United States and Pakistan seem to have cooperated extremely closely is in rendition of prisoners, isn't it? And essentially in abetting the administration's torture policies.
Well, yeah, with Pakistan, I don't think it's been as strong as it was, say, with Egypt or even the pariah state Syria. We've had really close relations with Egypt and Syria and Jordan on that front. I think with Pakistan, I think there's some worrisome trends with these prisoner releases I was talking about, not good enough cooperation. And frankly, your point in terms of the renditions and disappearances of these suspects, I think that's not good. But the problem with the freedom agenda is not only do as we say, not as we do. The way that neoconservatives and some conservatives, frankly, have tried to advance freedom and democracy around the world was done in such a way that forgot about some of the basic needs of ordinary citizens. And I saw this in the Palestinian territories. I saw this when I worked in Iraq in 2003 and 2004. And in a sense, I think we're making up for lost time in Iraq because we have a much more sensible policy that is focused on securing populations and a little bit more focused on the basic needs of individuals there. When we entered Iraq, we had Paul Bremer early on, who essentially tried to impose a flat tax, who got rid of a lot of the national institutions like the army, which we're reconstituting. I asked an Iraqi general recently what percentage of his force was in the previous army, and he said about 70 to 80%. So we went in with a neoconservative and in some ways a conservative agenda that downplayed the importance of governing institutions and building up these structures. And you can't advance freedom simply, with purple fingers and holding elections. And this was the case in the Palestinian territories, where that backfired, where the notion that advancing freedom and democracy defined by holding an election would defeat terrorism backfired clearly when Hamas, a terrorist organization, gained power. Why did they gain power? In part because they played on the basic needs of some of their citizens, complained about the corruption in the Palestinian Authority. So I agree with you that we have consistently around the world for decades talked about freedom and democracy, but the way that conservatives, in particular neoconservatives, have done this in not paying attention to some of those basic needs of citizens has actually undermined the overall effort there.
Well, I think the assumption was that democracy takes on a life of its own, and they woefully underestimated the effort that it takes, the building up of civil institutions on the ground. We didn't. If you look at the Bush record in Afghanistan, for example, it is pretty amazing that they essentially were uninterested in much allied cooperation. Rumsfeld certainly was in much allied cooperation in the invasion of Afghanistan. It was all very much a unilateralist approach.
Right, and to go in light and not really understand. I mean, you're right about Rice's foreign affairs essay in 2000, and then Bush also made the statement in debates with Al Gore saying that we're not going to do nation building. Well, frankly, that's actually been a promise he's delivered on. When you look at the state of affairs in Iraq and the billions of dollars we squandered there and in Afghanistan, and I think it goes back to the neoconservative/conservative focus and worldview. It's not just failures of implementation. When you look at places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Iraq, even the Gaza Strip, in many ways this has many of the features that many conservatives argue for here at home. There's no government in these places, or small government. Everybody has a gun, and extreme religion dominates the politics. And I think a lot of ideology...
That's not so different from the neoconservative alliance with evangelical Christians at home. I mean, it's interesting that the neocons underestimated religious extremism abroad when some of them embrace it at home.
Right, and the irony also, if you look at a place like, I know we're skipping around here, but you look at a place like Iraq, or many parts of the Middle East, the irony is that the oldest Christian communities in the world, in Iraq, in the Palestinian territories, have been decimated by the results of the freedom agenda. You've had Christians by the hundreds of thousands run out of Iraq. In Afghanistan, going back to Afghanistan, you remember the high-profile incident of the Christian convert, who actually, I think, had to go to Italy. So we've actually, through the freedom agenda, and there's a lot of rhetoric, and McCain is aping and mimicking this when he talks about freedom in Iraq. You look at the Iraqi leadership, very conservative Shiite leadership with close ties to Iran. So there's a lot of confusion in terms of what we're actually getting out of the freedom agenda in places like this. And then also in Pakistan, when we go back to who may likely succeed Musharraf, Nawaz Sharif is very close to elements of the Saudis. And in terms of principles and democratic values and respect for religious minorities or women, we should be deeply concerned about that, because I don't think we're getting that in terms of the high ideals. Plus, as we've talked about before, in Pakistan, we're not getting those core national security interests served well.
Right, which is one of the reasons I wonder when you look at Pakistan and the reaction to Musharraf's home imprisonment of the justices, which led to the widespread protests by lawyers. Isn't the more that the militants attack Pakistan proper and the corruption of the government itself, it is essentially feudal families you were talking about.
Right.
Doesn't that, in that sense, when I was talking about Weimar Germany, doesn't that help radicalize the middle class of Pakistan and make people more ready for extreme measures to counter
It could, but if you look at the results of the February elections, what was interesting to me was that this was a repudiation. Not only it was a thumping for Musharraf, his party got defeated soundly, but it was also a defeat for an alliance called the MMA in the northwestern part of the country, which was interesting to me. And this is one part of the elections that many people haven't talked about in Pakistan, that the Islamist parties fared very poorly, like the truly most deeply Islamists with the ties to extremist groups. They fared really poorly in these elections. So it was not only a vote against the autocracy or the dictatorship of Musharraf, it was also a turn against some of these Islamist groups. And I think that was a result of some of the instability that I talked about in 2007. 4 times as many Pakistanis being killed by terrorist attacks in the country compared to 2006. And it really mirrors, I think, a trend that some people have written about in the New Republic and some of the more academic journals about this trend in Al-Qaeda globally, that it's actually discredited itself through its own actions. I think this is a big part of the story in Iraq. And
that's Peter Bergen's argument, right?
Right. Yeah. It's not only Peter Bergen, but other. He's made that argument and a few others. When Abu Musab Zarqawi, for instance, conducted the bombings in Amman, Jordan, that killed many innocent civilians, you had Jordanians out in the streets pushing out against this. And this is, it goes back to where I was deeply concerned about the Bush administration putting front and center somebody like Zarqawi, the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, up until 2006 when he was killed, putting him front and center in presidential speeches, because the worldview of these individuals is quite marginal, and I think it was beginning to collapse in and on themselves.
Right, and in some ways we build these guys up into more than they are.
Right, and when you go to Indonesia, you go to Pakistan, Bangladesh. I've worked in. I've lived in the Middle East for about 5 years, and you see that a lot of ordinary folks, the vast majority, and they're a very silent majority because I think they're fearful of these extremist groups, but they see these as fringes, and the more that we put this in the frame of a central struggle, and they hate us because they hate our freedoms, as Bush has said. It's just not right. I mean,
I agree with you. That was the lamest argument that Bush made, which was that they actually oppose American policies. I mean, they have very concrete objections, both which some are obviously being expressed emotionally, but it's not that they despise freedom.
Right, and this is, in this new book I wrote with Nancy Soderberg, The Prosperity Agenda, we argue that when you go around the world, it's not that people want to vote in election. I mean, they want that, but and they're not opposed to democracy or having their voice in the system. But what they do want is something more basic security in their own neighborhoods, decent schools for their kids, a chance for a job. When we're going back to Pakistan, the number one issue in the eyes of Pakistanis, if you look at the public opinion polls, is not whether it's going to be Sharif or Zardari as the president. It's not, even the military assistance that's delivered by various countries to Pakistan. It is, what are we going to do about the price of inflation, or the increasing prices and the inflation in our country? What are we going to do about this what some have called the silent tsunami of food price increases in Pakistan? Ordinary Pakistanis just want their government to deliver. They want their system and their economic system to deliver too. And the more that the U.S. is seen as helping, because the one positive thing about the U.S. is that I still think we have a damaged image, but we still are admired for our technological prowess. Our people want to come here to our higher universities and a whole host of other things, and I think we can turn that around. But if we move beyond kind of the ideological push to advance freedom and focus on the basic needs.
The counter argument of the neocons is they would say, hold on there, Brian, well and good, but there are people out there trying to liquidate us, and we need to go out and kill them. And the number one focus is, okay, so Musharraf, or whoever wasn't such a great guy, and whoever runs Pakistan today, let's face it, is not going to be some shining Democrat either. What you do is you make the best out of a bad job. We've muddled through. The country isn't on the verge of collapse. They do have nuclear weapons. There's a limited amount of influence that we have there. So our job is sure, we can give that kind of aid, but our main focus has to be on stopping the terrorists and flushing them out and killing them. That's America's number one priority.
Yeah, and I don't think many people would disagree with that as a priority. What they might disagree with is the means by which we go about achieving it. And I actually think there's actually been a quiet revolution going on in national security policy here in Washington. And I think if you look at, for instance, Secretary Gates's speeches, he gave a speech last month. He talked in November, and what he's talking about is actually something that I think defies kind of ideological stripes in a certain sense. There's a growing consensus, and I've noticed this among progressives like myself or liberals, and then also some more traditional conservatives about the need to use the full range of U.S. powers, invest not only in the military means, but also focusing on some basic issues like economic development. And he's put this front and center.
In principle, Brian, I would agree with you. But as we're talking about this, I just wrote this piece on Walt Rostow in the National Interest, who was the original guru of. He was one of the fathers of neoconservatism, essentially, in its earlier incarnation. Mm-hmm. And he preached economic. He kind of turned Karl Marx on his head and argued that capitalism was the true motor of progress.
Right.
And so you had LBJ, we're going to create a New Deal on the Mekong Delta. And the idea was very prevalent in the early 60s among Kennedy-type liberals that if we just, dispense enough international aid, that peasants and other people would come to see that ideology wasn't really that important and that what really mattered was economic progress. In principle, I agree with you that obviously the Bush administration, didn't just fail to exercise American soft power, but they radically diminished it. But is it really enough? It gets back to my neocon point, which is, the neocons are going to say agenda number one is, look, the neocons are not huge fans of Robert Gates either. I mean, that's why John Bolton and others at the American Enterprise Institute are essentially denouncing Bush as an appeaser.
Right, and I think
this is going to be a very contentious issue in the 2008 election. I think it's going to be a real interesting dividing line between John McCain and Barack Obama, because I don't think that John McCain is going to espouse soft power. I think he's going to portray, obviously, but it's going to be much more forceful in a week or so after the convention, or even at the convention. He's going to try and portray the Democrats as what you're saying is tantamount to appeasement and defeat.
Right.
And you're not aiming for victory in the war on terrorism, but for kind of something that will never lead to capitulation. That it's not enough to hand out rice and beans to peasants in Pakistan and promise a better future. That we need to up our military efforts radically in Afghanistan and in rooting out terrorists in Pakistan.
Yeah, and I think the Obama response will be that it's not just about rice and beans and economic assistance. And back to one of your points about the New Deal for the Mekong and promoting capitalism, those two things are actually quite different. And a free market system versus New Deal. What strikes me when I go to, for instance, U.S. Special Forces war games where they're talking about what it takes to stabilize places like Pakistan or Afghanistan, they talk about public works projects that put people to work. It's part of, I think, the quiet reason why a big part of the surge was working. It wasn't just the introduction of about a 10% increase of U.S. forces. It was the application of different tactics that were dependent on building up state structures and institutions like the police and other things. So when you talk about promoting prosperity or an economic agenda, to do it and do it in a way that helps stabilize these societies, it has to be done in a way that actually helps build state structures and makes them less corrupt and more effective in making neighborhoods, I think, stronger. I think in terms of what Obama would respond, and I think you're right in terms of what McCain, he's already tipped his hand. His speech yesterday at the or 2 days ago at the VFW, he tipped his hand in terms of he's going to make arguments cast in this framework of we've got to stay on the offensive. It's interesting to me that many, Bush and McCain, both make references to World War II and staying on the offensive. And I think in many ways their approach will be a very 20th century. We've just got to use the military to advance our agenda. And I think when you listen to Obama and his speech in Berlin, his national security speeches, it's much more closely aligned with the thinking of Secretary Gates. And I don't think you disagree with that. And I think that's the fundamental divide here.
So essentially McCain is kind of pursuing, it really goes back to the 19th century, the Civil War, the General Grant strategy, right, where you just overwhelm your opponent, whereas you're arguing for a kind of a multi-pronged approach.
Well, and I don't think, I think a multi-pronged approach is necessary in the 21st century. When I was in Israel last month, and you talk to Israeli security officials and all of the lessons that they think they've learned from the conflict with Hezbollah in 2006, and it's simply that conventional military means against these non-state actors, these forces that actually use economic tools to boost their credibility in certain neighborhoods and parts of Lebanon. Conventional military means is not the centerpiece of the struggle. It is, one thing. It's one component. You'll never remove that, but we need to actually have a much more comprehensive approach because you simply, in this day and age, can't go in and carpet bomb. We didn't even do this in Baghdad. Right. We
don't. There's no. We have such sophisticated weapons. The whole point is that they try to wage it as effectively and as precisely as possible.
Right. Yeah.
What it does occur to me in talking about this is that maybe George Bush is the in a sense, the executioner of the old-style Republican foreign policy, even though he didn't want to do it, even though he preached a somewhat more isolationist, more cautious line during his campaign in 2000, he is essentially followed a very interventionist and foreign policy that's mutated into nation building. I mean, as you were saying, Gates endorses it. Obviously, the military has come to recognize that you have Petraeus, whose philosophy seems to be infiltrating the armed forces now. Maybe we're witnessing a radical change and that McCain himself, no matter what he says now, I do not believe that he would follow a significantly, that he would jettison all of this.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the wrench in the works that's come in, and it's not come in 2009 or 2010, and it's not. I don't think it really matters whether it's Obama or McCain on this issue. Is the fiscal challenges we have here at home. We've essentially gone through the last 6 years with a president and a Congress, with both parties in Congress, saying that we could have our cake and eat it too, that we could have our tax cuts and project military power around the world and not resolve some of these entitlement programs here at home. The numbers at some point won't add up and will collapse in and on themselves. And I don't think it will immediately mean massive budget cuts in the Pentagon. I don't think that's happening. But obviously we will. Whoever is president is going to significantly curtail the American presence in Iraq, which costs a fortune. Right, and that's one component of an overall structure. My point here is that the arguments that Gates, which I support, and others have been making in terms of investing in the civilian infrastructure, the State Department, USAID, and other things, these are easy statements to make when just as policy statements and speeches. But in terms of getting the budgets and the numbers for this, it's going to be an even harder struggle, especially when the U.S. is seen to be in a recession here at home, and we have the baby boomer generation actually getting set to retire. So our ability in the next decade to project power in the ways that we've done in the last 6 or 7 years may be much more constrained by political forces here at home, pure demographics and voter preferences, and then just the fiscal challenges that I think we've gone from a 2 to 3% surplus to a 2 to 3% deficit under George Bush, and that may go away at some point, but it's going to require some tough decisions to be made for those to go away and reform Social Security, Medicare, and continue to project power in the world.
Well, if we look at specifically at Pakistan, where we've been shoveling wheelbarrows of cash and dumping them over there, how much longer do you think? I guess the question for me is, one of the main tools of America to try and gain influence over Pakistan of the Bush administration, and it doesn't seem to have worked all that effectively, was to give them billions in aid. And I wonder how that can be redirected. How much leverage do you think the next president will actually have over Pakistan, given the entrenched, decades-long support that they've had for militants in the region?
Well, I think it states the obvious that we've not had much leverage as already, even with those $10 to $12 billion that we've sent over there. We may have influenced some of the generals and some of the people in the military and intelligence structure. But I think we focus on bilateral aid to the detriment of other forms of economic tools. I mean, it strikes me that when I was in Pakistan, you see that there are at least 2 to 3 million Pakistanis living in oil-rich Gulf Arab countries. Those remittances that they send back to their families have much more of an impact monetarily on Pakistan than anything we've actually sent in development assistance, and I think it even dwarfs the military assistance that we've provided. So we often look at just the state-to-state sort of structures, and I think this implies that I think we should look at ways that we can expand our ties economically with a country like Pakistan. As unrealistic as it seems, they do have a lot of educated individuals there. In many ways, the ties that we have with India in technology and other things, we can explore ways that we might be able to expand that. All of that won't give us a lot of leverage overnight. But yeah, as we argue in our book, The Prosperity Agenda, when we do things that are tangibly and demonstrably seen as benefiting Pakistan, like we did in response to the 2005 earthquake, we actually see a tremendous increase in our favorability with Pakistanis. People still talk about the delivery of assistance that we provided, and we argue in our book that it's this, along with the Asia tsunami relief efforts, was probably one of the finest foreign policy moments for George Bush in terms of how we've expanded, or we were actually, addressing some of the challenges in the diminishment of our power and how we were viewed around the world.
I guess I take a somewhat more grimmer view of this, and it's occurring to me we should maybe go through one scenario that I have for either Obama or McCain in looking at the future, as you were just talking about. What happens if there's another attack on the United States by al-Qaeda, let's say an attack that hits 4 or 5 cities simultaneously?
Right. Dirty
bombs, whatever, maybe not dirty bombs, but something that we're not prepared for, and there are massive casualties.
Yeah.
And let's say that happens in January of 2009, and it's either President McCain or Obama. And the logical response, I would assume, by the United States would be that we would really try to launch an all-out assault then on the al-Qaeda forces that we're sort of monitoring and taking pot shots at right now.
Yeah.
What would be the reaction in Pakistan itself? I mean, would you have major upheaval if there were essentially an American attack major attack on Pakistani territory?
I think if it's just an attack and there's nothing that's done, in the way that after 9/11 we coordinated with many countries around the world and basically built a true international coalition, got the United Nations support and got the support of people in Pakistan. I think if we do those sorts of things, even if we do those sorts of things, they will be a visceral gut reaction to any kind of direct military action by the U.S. in Pakistan. If we could get the Pakistani military, to do this, and frankly, I've made all of my criticisms in public about the Pakistani government, but the Pakistani military and those who have served in their army have suffered some pretty extreme losses in their attempts to pacify areas inside their own borders, like the Swat Valley. These sacrifices by some of the foot soldiers, there are elements that really have been trying to fight this good battle. The challenge in Pakistan is that there's so many shades of gray and areas of gray where some elements of the intelligence on ISI and the military don't seem to be working with us. But there are others who've actually sacrificed a great deal in terms of thousands of lives in this internal battle. It's better if, this sort of battle is fought, as we're seeing, in Iraq and other places where we're not the ones to be seen in the lead. But I think necessarily, if the hypothetical scenario that you outlined there, were to happen, I can't imagine a U.S. president just sitting back idly and passing UN resolutions. There will be military action.
See, I think if Obama were to try and put together a coalition, he would be accused of being a traitor, and the Republicans would try to impeach him if there wasn't a major attack being launched within a week or two.
I think
that would. I guess I take a more apocalyptic view than you do, which is that you probably would have pretty major upheaval in Pakistan if something like that were to happen, because I think the United States would be under overwhelming pressure to react, because essentially in some ways it seems rather ominous that we are recapitulating the mistakes that were made under the Clinton administration, obviously in somewhat different form, but we have a regrouped al-Qaeda in training people.
Yeah.
And that is just something that when you look back at the Clinton administration policy, the Republicans have always stated that they were much too timorous in going after al-Qaeda. They called it a police enforcement strategy. They mocked Clinton for his passivity. But now you have, Bush towing a fine line because he doesn't want to create too much tumult inside Pakistan, essentially following a policy that isn't all that different from what Bill Clinton did.
Yeah, and I would add it's also not all that different from what George Bush did in the first 9 months in office when he got the warning that Bin Laden. I mean, it's a small point, but I think it's important. When he got the warning in August 7 years ago that Bin Laden was determined to strike the U.S., he reportedly told the briefer, "Okay, you've covered your ass. Now get out of here." So I think we were all blasé, and I think in the absence of another attack since 9/11 inside of the United States, we've been very we've been remiss in terms of focusing on this as a potential threat.
Why hasn't Barack Obama? I mean, my gut instinct always has been that the only way to allay this perception of the Democrats being soft on national security is to go on the offensive, which he has done in some speeches. I mean, he said, that he marks a break, and he's not, conforming or to the old image of the wussbag Democrat who can't stand up for American national interests. But I still don't see a comprehensive critique. Like, this is one issue, it seems to me, on this whole Pakistan issue and the regrouping of Al-Qaeda. I'm amazed, and maybe I've missed something, but that he isn't going into this chapter and verse and accusing the Bush administration of betraying American national interests.
Yeah, I share I share your view on this, and I think Pakistan is an area where I think he could highlight, and in large part not only because of the Bush mistakes, but also because John McCain has said virtually nothing. He says, "I will follow Bin Laden to the gates of hell." That doesn't mean anything in terms of a policy.
That's the kind of cheap rhetoric that Bush was using. Remember?
Right. It's just like axis of evil. Bush said that North Korea, Iran, and Iraq were part of the axis of evil. With Iraq, we invaded, and everybody knows that story. With North Korea, they actually got nuclear weapons. And with Iran, they're well on their way to getting nuclear weapons. And we didn't have my argument has been on Iran. We didn't actually have an Iran policy from 2002 to 2006. And we finally constructed one that was largely based on sanctions and international diplomacy with the potential for the threat of military force. I never really believed that the Bush administration was serious about striking Iran. So I think Barack Obama would do well to highlight this, because I think this is a conservative a neoconservative, but also a Republican Party weakness, because Pakistan will be, whomever wins the presidency, a major challenge. It is a national security challenge, and I think the problem, and this is not to excuse Obama, I think it's quite complicated for a lot of Americans to explain it to voters in terms of a country that's in transition and Musharraf's departure, and they're waiting to see who's going to be the head of the country. But I agree with you. I think highlighting this, plus its linkage to Afghanistan, would be a good thing for Obama to do to focus the national security debate.
Well, he's got a couple of weeks. We would need to move quickly, and it would make for an interesting debate.
Right.
And it's something I don't think that Pastor Rick Warren brought up. But for this Blogging Heads debate, we didn't need a pastor.
No, we didn't.
We're not in a zone of silence or a cone of silence, as all Blogging Head watchers can see.
Right.
And I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, and it was a great conversation.
Great. Good talking to you, Jacob. I'm Brian Katulis. Yeah, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.